Hey there, I'm Ashley Korslund. Welcome to The Story. Pat has the night off, so you're stuck with me tonight. All the ways to communicate with us are at the bottom of your screen. You can email us at thestory@kgw.com, use the hashtag TheStoryKGW on Twitter, or leave us a voicemail. You can call our number 503-226-5090. The FAA tracks close calls at airports. They're known as runway incursions. Without strict regulation, planes could be at risk of colliding with pilots going where they shouldn't or taking off or landing at the wrong times. For most airports, this happens maybe a handful of times every year. But a local airport stands out with this issue. That's Hillsboro Airport, where the number of runway incursions since the start of 2022 is catching attention. Reporter Evan Watson shares the story.
The FAA has its eyes on Hillsboro.
Let's take a look at some of these tricky areas from the flight deck.
Sharing this training video on the confusing spots and the risks for pilots.
The mix of pilot experience and aircraft capabilities makes HIO an interesting and challenging environment.
You up the runway yet?
We're talking about runway incursions. Think close calls or safety risks at an airport, like when a pilot enters a runway at the wrong time. This animation shows a near miss from JFK Airport earlier this year between two planes filled with passengers.
Delta 1943, cancel takeoff clearance.
And when that happens, there is a risk of collision with other aircraft that may be landing or departing on that runway. That could result in injury or fatalities.
The FAA is strict about tracking and reporting runway incursions, wanting to avoid collisions. Most airports might report a couple of incursions in a year. PDX has 3 in the last 3 years. But in reviewing FAA data, the Hillsboro Airport stands out. 30 runway incursions between February of 2022 and this February.
Anytime you see some of these numbers, there should be concern.
Hassan Shahidi leads the Flight Safety Foundation, an independent organization that advocates for aviation safety.
The standard is 0. We do not want any runway incursions occurring at these airports for any of these categories.
Most of the runway incursions at HIO were minor. They didn't require intervention by a pilot or air traffic controller to avoid a crash. But still, these minor incursions draw attention.
Certainly, airport complexity is a part of that root cause.
HIO has parallel and intersecting runways and a parallel taxiway that can confuse new pilots.
The problem occurs when aircraft departing the run-up area for runway 31 left cross the hold short line and enter the runway safety area, conflicting with arriving or departing aircraft.
And the airport is a training ground for flight schools. Shahidi says pilot inexperience plays a role.
It is important for the airport and for the flight schools to really focus on this, make sure that their students are trained on this.
Meanwhile, the FAA is paying close attention to an increase in runway incursions nationwide. The agency held a safety summit in March after close calls at major airports, and it just announced $100 million for runway improvements at airports across the country.
It has been a wake-up call. They are serious, and the aviation community and the FAA are coming together to put in solutions to eliminate them.
Hillsboro isn't one of those airports getting federal money. The Port of Portland, which operates the airport, turned down our interview requests for this story. But the FAA did answer some of our questions, saying runway incursions are more common at airports with flight training, and reducing these risks is one of the FAA's highest safety priorities. The FAA also says, while HIO is not experiencing a lot of high-risk events, it is experiencing more runway incursions than many other airports. So the Runway Safety Office is monitoring changes.
We are in week 6 of a massive billion-dollar class action lawsuit over the 2020 Labor Day wildfires that ravaged Oregon. 17 plaintiffs are suing Pacific Power, saying the company could and should have done more to prevent the fires that destroyed hundreds of structures and cost several lives. But Pacific Power claims it is not liable. So before we get into this week's testimony, let's recap what got us here. The big question at the heart of this trial: what caused the fires? Investigations are still pending, so now a Multnomah County jury will determine who or what is at fault. The plaintiffs involved here allege that Pacific Power utility lines ignited some of the largest wildfires that year, and that the utility and its parent company, PacifiCorp, did not deactivate certain power lines during the high wind event. It's what's called public safety power shutoffs. So that's when a power company turns off power lines as a precaution before high winds will move through an area. The lawsuit claims that when the heavy winds brought down trees, they collided with active power lines, causing sparks that eventually grew into colossal infernos. But Pacific Power attorneys argue that the power company can only do so much to prevent severe weather. They blame climate change and the spread of other wildfires, not electrical equipment. So over the past couple weeks, the company has called defense witnesses to the stand. Yesterday, a top executive explained why Pacific Power didn't cut the power early. Alan Barrett testified that the company didn't make that call in 2020 because he says it lacked the data.
The company did not deploy any resources at all into these 4 fire areas to report on conditions on the ground before fire started, right?
That's correct. Field resources were prioritized and deployed to the areas of high fire threat that were already identified, but in these areas, as there was nothing leading us to these specific areas, resources were not deployed.
The company didn't have any information about potential threat of fire in the Santiam Canyon. Is that your testimony?
That we weren't getting enough information back from Western Weather that was regard to PSPS thresholds being exceeded in any specific area in our service territory.
However, attorneys for the plaintiffs pressed Barrett on how the company's responsibility, how much it spent on wildfire mitigation, and if Pacific Power made the right call. Pacific Power then argued that power shutoffs are somewhat of a last resort, as turning off electricity can also be dangerous for people who rely on power.
Looking at that risk of not having energy, not having power in a community can increase the risk versus the risk that we're trying to avoid of a potential wildfire. The larger area we de-energize, the more risk we're creating. And so if we didn't have a very specific granular section in mind when we're considering public safety power shutoff, and if we had to do an entire region, that's a very large, number of people without power, which can create a lot of risk.
The plaintiffs are seeking $1.6 billion in this case. The trial, by the way, started in late April. It's expected to continue into this month, so we'll keep you updated on how things progress from here. Well, family members of a hiker found shot to death in Southwest Washington now plan to sue the law enforcement agency tasked with investigating the killing. It's a case that dates back to August of last year. You might remember this. Aaron Christensen and his dog, they were shot to death on a hike near Wallop Lake in Lewis County. The accused shooter has not been charged, and the Lewis County Sheriff's Office says he won't be. Now, Christensen's family is planning to sue the county. That's Aaron Christensen on the base, performing on KGW some 4 years before he'd be shot and killed on a camping trip in Washington.
From there, it's just been a roller coaster and a nightmare, really.
Deputies found Christensen and his dog dead on a trail in August. The lifelong outdoorsman was 49 years old.
The family was being told that he had had a heart attack and then he was shot, and that just seemed absolutely ridiculous to us.
2 months later, Christensen's death was ruled a homicide. Detectives identified a 20-year-old shooter after getting a tip from the suspect's family member. Deputies were told the man feared Christensen and his dog were wild animals, but he later found their bodies. In April, Lewis County prosecutors announced they would not pursue felony charges, citing lack of evidence.
An arrest and some justice would at least give us some healing and some closure. And at this point, the Friends group really believes we're being denied that.
Family representing Christensen's estate are now planning to sue the Lewis County Sheriff's Department, alleging the results from a necropsy performed on Christensen's dog did not match the narrative released by investigators.
The impropriety that we're seeing and that we believe occurred happened with Buzzo and the dog being in the exclusive care of Lewis County Sheriff and various deputies there, and suddenly popping up with an exit wound that the medical professionals say was not there.
Christensen's family accused the county of mishandling the deceased puppy in order to sabotage a criminal investigation.
Nothing will really bring Aaron back, but maybe the lawsuit will at least hold them liable for taking Aaron's life.
Well, Aaron's friends are remembering him the best way they can. They say they're planning to release a tribute album in his name, with all the money going to his family. It's been 75 years since a flood washed away the second largest city in Oregon at the time.
It was the worst weather disaster in the United States in 1948.
We're going into the KGW vault to tell you the story of the Vanport flood and how it changed Portland in a big way.
The city fathers at that time did not want it rebuilt. They wanted Vanport essentially gone and erased.
When the story returns. Hey, welcome back. Keep sending your questions and your comments, by the way, to thestory@kgw.com or leave us a call or give us a call and leave a voicemail at 503-226-5090. Well, this week marked 75 years since the Vanport flood. At least 17 people died and 18,000 lost their homes when a dike failed just north of Portland on Memorial Day, 1948. The city was home to thousands of people who had come to work in the area during World War II. Let's take a look at the history of Vanport from the KGW Vault.
The city of Vanport was built during World War II in North Portland, where Delta Park is today. At the time, it was the second largest city in Oregon and the largest federal housing project in the country, home to 40,000 people. About 40% of the population was black. Most people worked in the Kaiser shipyards for the war effort, but a lot of them left town when the war ended. By 1948, the population had been cut in half. That is when disaster struck. On Memorial Day, the Columbia River breached the railroad levee, spilling into Vanport and destroying the city. At least 17 people died.
It was the worst weather disaster in the United States in 1948. And so it had national and international news. President Truman came and he said we should rebuild it. However, the city fathers at that time did not want it rebuilt. They wanted Vanport essentially gone and erased, which is part of the reason that so few people know about Vanport today.
But the city left a legacy behind, helping integrate Portland and Oregon, a state that not long before had few black people due to its black exclusion laws.
These were strangers, 40,000 strangers, who created a community. And when that community was disrupted, they brought that community feeling right into Portland and changed it from extremely conservative to what we have now.
The issues of home, displacement, and community that Vanport really helps us dig into are still clearly issues that the whole country and the city of Portland are facing. I mean, the city of Vanport was built because there was not enough housing.
The Vanport Mosaic Festival is held each year in May, complete with a day of remembrance to talk about the history of Vanport and what our community can continue to learn from it.
So after the flood, many black Portlanders relocated to the Albina neighborhood in North and Northeast Portland, which was already home to the majority of the city's black population. People there owned their own homes and opened businesses. But in the 1950s and 60s, projects like building Interstate 5 and Memorial Coliseum began to displace families and destroy much of that neighborhood. The Oregonian is looking into that time period, and we think their coverage is worth your time. They published the third installment of their Publishing Prejudice project, looking at how the Oregonian covered Albina's displacement. And what they found was that the newspaper covered up the harm that was caused when the neighborhood was dismantled and instead celebrated it. They wrote, the review found the Oregonian masked the destruction of Albina with the shiny gloss of progress. The newspaper disregarded people who lived where white leaders wanted to build the interstate. The Oregonian looked back through hundreds of news stories and interviewed former newspaper staffers and people whose families were displaced from Albina. What they found was that the newspaper's coverage of the neighborhood was disparaging, going back decades to when large numbers of black people began arriving in the Portland area. One headline in 1942 read, "New Negro Migrants Worry City," and said the growing population was a, quote, problem. But they only quoted a police inspector who reported adding a patrol in Albina because of numerous complaints of beat-ups, robberies, and noisy parties. The paper later went on to publish that black people should be allowed to come to Portland, but not too many of them. The newspaper then began to call the area blighted, which became justification for raising it for Interstate 5 and other projects. The Oregonian wrote that some blame community indifference, some blame a lack of individual initiative by Albina home dwellers. Some see the blight as an inescapable consequence of low-income, uneducated families with little aspiration. The paper also praised the path of Interstate 205 for avoiding wealthy white neighborhoods. So as homes were destroyed and people were forced to move, the Oregonian barely covered that portion of the story. Now they're talking to people who lost their homes about the pain that the destruction caused them. It's had lasting impacts too. Today, black people in Portland are far less likely to own homes than white people. In 1960, 80% of Portland's black residents lived in Albina, and many own their homes, as we said. Only 10% of the city's black population now lives in Albina, which has experienced a lot of gentrification. You can check out the Oregonian's coverage. They looked into discrimination on the newspaper staff during that time, and they'll show what some of the areas in Albina look like now, where homes were destroyed. You can find all of that at OregonLive.com. Well, meanwhile, in Washington, members of communities once prohibited from buying homes under racist homeowner agreements will soon get home buying assistance money from the state. The law signed last week by Governor Jay Inslee will help some first-time home buyers cover down payments and closing costs. Drew Mickelson at our sister station in Seattle has a look at the long road it took to get here.
You know, you feel like you are blessed to have nature and community gardens.
Welcome to Shoreline's Innis Arden, where the selling point has always been the view.
I never get tired of the view, and I'm always so grateful to my husband.
Winona Holland-Tagg and her husband John have lived here since getting married in 1978.
Hi.
Today, she's learning how to play tennis at the neighborhood courts.
It allows you just to feel free in your own community.
But had she met John 10 years earlier, Winona would not have been able to live in Innis Arden. When it was established in the 1940s, developers sold it as a restricted community. The fine print made it clear in black and white. No person other than one of the white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property.
It said no blacks, no Jews, no Asians. It was designed to keep white America white.
And it wasn't just Innis Arden. State-funded research has identified hundreds of neighborhoods, almost 50,000 homes all across the state with covenants containing racially restrictive language. The whites-only practice was outlawed in 1968, but the wording remains on the books. Not at Innis Arden, though, thanks to work done by Winona and her neighbors who fought to erase the racist language.
It concerns me. It makes my heart sad for the fact that people were missing out on the opportunity to really appreciate and value people of other cultures.
Home ownership is the gateway to the American dream and intergenerational wealth building.
The history of the covenants has now prompted legislators to take action.
You may not have heard, but this is the first in the nation statewide reparations bill.
Lawmakers say it is time for the state to pay up for its racist past.
Let's celebrate signing this bill, which I'm doing happily right now.
The new law creates a $100 document fee added to the purchase of every home. The funds raised will pay for down payments and closing costs for first-time homebuyers who either lived in the state when the restrictions were legal before 1968 or their descendants. And it's considered a loan, one the homeowners must pay back to the state if that first home is resold.
It finally puts me in the game.
Lichelle Lucas and her children Evan and Kennedy all qualify for the new loan.
My dad's side of the family moved up here in 1963. So they experienced things that I don't think I'd be able to take. Owning a home is everybody's dream. And as a single mother, a black mother to two beautiful children, I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do.
This summer, the Lucases are moving into a new home in West Seattle built by Habitat for Humanity, Seattle King County. She's glad more doors will be opening in the very same communities her grandparents were shut out from.
I wish that they could hear that, at least Washington State is taking that step in the right direction. And your great grandkids, they won't go through what you went through.
Their struggles are helping you.
Yeah.
I'm believing that this is a chance to start moving forward.
Racism is something Winona Hollins-Haig has dealt with all her life.
This is me, right on the end.
Once bused from the Central District to an all-white elementary school in Laurelhurst, she's now living her best life in a place that once didn't want her.
I have always seen the promise. I've seen the promise, I've advocated for the promise, and now, today, we saw the signing, and we are a part of the promise.
Wow, what an incredible story. Well, still ahead, a recovery program that worked when nothing else did. We'll take you to the Blanchet Farm, where people moving past drug addiction are finding healing and a new start.
Straight ahead at 6:30, Mayor Ted Wheeler's plan to curb gun violence in Portland will not include gunshot detection technology. Why he says he's tabling a pilot project for now. Plus, why a parking permit system is doing little to solve dangerous overcrowding at Multnomah Falls. And outgrowing hunger, the new partnership to provide crucial services for families through community gardening and farming. That's next at 6:30. We hope to see you then.
People struggling with addiction often have a hard time finding a recovery program that works for them. There's one program in Carlton that's using farm work to help people reach sobriety, and they're getting ready to expand. Here's Blair Best.
On a farm in rural Yamhill County, Miggs starts over.
Take a big bite. It's been a beautiful thing. Like, it's one of a kind for sure.
About a month ago, he left Chicago after finding Oregon's Blanchet Farm online, a free residential program for people in recovery.
I was, coming off methamphetamines for, it was like 2.5 years. It was hard for me to look in the mirror because I didn't recognize who I become. Now it's a little easier on the eyes,
Other, more traditional rehab programs never worked for him.
It's a good kind of therapy without having a counselor or something.
A different kind of healing, on his terms.
You have a lot of time to reflect, because these animals, they're not in no hurry. You just take your time and try to read them out, and you learn their character, and, in a sense, you learn your own character again.
That's huge for a guy, it builds some self-esteem. It lets him feel good about something for a change.
Ross Sears has run the farm for 15 years.
I came up through the program too. I still got to earn it, but I can relate to him, so that's probably kind of very unique in a lot of ways.
Construction is underway for a new dorm facility here at the farm, and with that will come more case management services to help those in recovery.
The dorms will be 2 stories high.
Soon, about 20 men will stay and work at the farm for 6 to 9 months, or however long it takes.
We got one. Hopefully, when I go back home, people will see the change and the difference, not only physically, but in my actions and mentally.
In Carlton, Blair Best, KGW News.
Now that looks like a great program, and I hope it's very successful. Well, hey, that brings us to the end of our show. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. The news at 6:30 with David and Laurel is up next.